Firstly, thank you so much for joining us on a Sunday evening. The Ashoka Economic Society is extremely excited to present the fifth installment of our Indian economy webinar series today. As you all can see, we have Professor Jayati Ghosh with us today, and she'll be talking to us about pandemics, lockdowns, and social protection. You all might know Professor Jayati Ghosh is the chairperson for the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi.
Sorry, actually, Samyukta, I'm not the chairperson. I don't know. I keep trying to change it on Wikipedia or something. And that was about 10 years ago. But anyway, I'm just a professor, yes? Okay. That's not your fault. It's just, I keep trying to change that Wikipedia thing, but I don't know why it doesn't change.
Really sorry, Professor. Right. So Professor teaches economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi and has previously held appointments at the University of Cambridge and Tufts University. Her writing includes several books like Crisis as Conquest, Learning from East Asia, and Neverly Done and Poorly Paid, Women's Work in Globalising India, and several other publications in peer-reviewed journals. Professor's core areas of study are international economics, employment patterns in developing countries, macroeconomic policy, and issues related to gender and development. We're really glad to have you with us here today, Professor. And over to you in a few minutes. Just wanted to clarify the format of the talk for everyone. So Professor will be talking to us for about 35 to 40 minutes. And for the last 20 to 25 minutes, we'll be taking questions from the audience. You can drop your questions throughout the talk in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and others will be reading them out at the end of the session. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Samyukta. It's a pleasure to be virtually with all of you. I'm sorry that it has to be in this format, but that's what we can do nowadays. I'm going to share a presentation that I have, which, it's not strictly necessary, but it just contains a few slides that might be of interest. So, wait a minute. Okay, so let's just begin by trying to understand what this whole social protection thing is, okay? There is a concept of a social protection floor, and it's something that has been done by international organizations. The ILO has been very strongly behind it, but the UN agencies in general have put their weight behind it. A number of countries have actually explicitly adopted it. In the 2000s, there was a bunch of Latin American countries, but some Asian countries as well, Vietnam and so on. That have adopted it as something to make as a clear part of their goals. And what are they? Basically, it means that you're going to create a set of basic social security guarantees over the life cycle, and to ensure that all your population gets basic health care and basic income security. So the global argument suggests that it should include at least the following: essential health care, including maternity care, and of course over the life cycle. Basic income security for children, that is access to nutrition, education, care, and all other goods and services. Income security for people in the active working age, especially those who cannot earn sufficient incomes in cases of sickness, maternity, disability, but also unemployment. And I think that's important to remember. And basic income security, or what is called a universal pension for older persons. So in India, I suspect we would immediately think of another one, which is food security, simply because we have such a large hungry population. And that is certainly something which is effectively provided for. When they talk about basic income security, they're clearly thinking also of the possibility of being able to buy your own food. Now, as it happens, India provides very little social protection, right? I mean, the universal health coverage is still a distant dream. We all know how inadequate our public health services are. So I'm not going to belabor the point. We can come back to that in the questions if you like. But the Ayushman Bharat, or the PM Jan Arogya Yojana, that has actually failed, not to put too fine a point on it. It's too limited, it's wrongly conceived, it's got very, very little money going into it. It's a private insurance-based program which essentially rewards insurance providers and private hospitals without necessarily benefiting patients and making both patients and governments shell out on the premium. And we have very clear evidence that during the pandemic, it has failed miserably. So clearly, we have to think of a different form of ensuring universal health care. The other critical feature about India is that most of our workforce, the dominant part of it, between 90 to 95%, is informally employed. We don't have good numbers for how many are. We also have, by the way, a very generous definition of formality and informality, which is to say that according to our official statistics, if a worker has any one of the following given by the employer, any one, not all three, either paid leave or a written contract or any form of social security coming from that employer, then that person is seen to be formally employed. Now, that's a really low bar, okay? Even with that very, very low bar, 90% of our workers don't have it. And half of the workers have no social security of any kind, even under the public schemes, even under PMJAY or the program for pensions for the poor, or etc., etc. Half the workers basically are either not covered because it's explicitly meant for people under BPL, and as you know, you need all kinds of things to prove that you fall below the poverty line, or they're simply just, excluded for various reasons. So we really have a very large proportion of the population that is excluded from any kind of social protection. Even when they're included, these public schemes are tiny. They're really pathetic. They provide very, very inadequate amounts of benefit. And what we found, and this has been found very often, but a survey that I did with some students of workers, even in the National Capital Region, in Greater Delhi, shows that most of the workers in the factory areas and in other places were unaware of the entitlements that they had under the scheme. Whether it is Janani Suraksha Yojana, or it is the health schemes, or it is the pension schemes, or even their own PF entitlements, they were unaware. So we do have the National Food Security Act, and it was designed to meet one major gap, which is food access. We can talk about the extent of the hungry. I can tell you more about that if you like, but I think all of you pretty much know that there is a serious problem of food security in our country. But even this work by Jean Drèze and Ritika Khera has suggested that it excludes around 120 million. Even the bureaucrats will agree that it excludes around 100 million. And it also is very, very basic in terms of its provision. It covers the major food grains, rice and wheat, to a limited extent in some places sugar. Some states, especially the southern states, have enlarged the basket that is provided. So they will also give a little bit of cooking oil, a little bit of soap, pulses, etc., etc. But the basic scheme is actually very, very limited. We need to make it much more broad-based to provide at least some minimum elements of a balanced diet at affordable prices. The other big scheme that we have that could be called social protection, although officially and actually it's just an employment program, is the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act. Now this is a very important act because it's been a lifeline for this particular pandemic, but in general, it's a lifeline simply because of the fact that our economic growth trajectory has been unable to generate required employment. And this provides many things. It provides a cushion, of course, but it provides wage bargaining possibilities for the workers because it actually gives work at minimum wages. It has therefore succeeded in reducing gender wage gaps where it has been widely used, simply because women are able to access that program at the minimum wage, and therefore the market wages have risen for women in the areas where it's been active. And it's had a whole range of other positive effects. We can talk about those. There are the usual typical critiques that, there's a lot of money wasted, that in many places there are ghost workers and so on and so forth. No doubt there is corruption, as there is corruption in practically every government scheme. Just like there's a lot of wastage and leakages and corruption in schooling and health. Does that mean we stop public schooling and health? No, it means we fix that problem. And NRAJ has been, I would argue, in the states where it's been successful, it's been actually quite remarkable in terms of the ability to provide minimum incomes to a large part of the workforce and to generate effective demand in the country. So why is this important? Why is social protection important? And I'm coming back to that whole thing about why was there a global desire for a social protection floor? First of all, it reduces poverty, especially multidimensional poverty, and it prevents people from falling into poverty for sort of life cycle episodes. You know, you have a major illness in the family, or you have a childbirth which becomes expensive, or etc., and the entire household falls into poverty, or multidimensional poverty because lack of nutrition in your formative years, or even in the womb, lack of nutrition of the mother, has huge impact on brain development and your potential and your capabilities in future. All of this I'm sure you know, so I won't dwell on it. Universal social protection actually also reduces inequality. By making the basics available to everyone, there's a significant easing of the tensions that arise from great inequality. And therefore also it reduces social tensions. And of course, if you are a very instrumentalist and GDP-minded economist, then you would argue that it creates a more healthy and productive workforce. Quite apart from the benefits it has on humanitarian grounds, it actually benefits you in terms of generating a workforce that will be more productive over time. It's not an accident that the East Asian economies that turned out to be the success stories of the late 20th century all put a lot of emphasis on health, education, basic needs of the working class. Across the board, you will not find an exception in that category of the successful economies, whether it's Japan or the East Asian NICs, or more recently China, some of the more successful Southeast Asian countries like Malaysia, Thailand, and so on. Okay, but the other point, and the point that is useful to remember right now in this pandemic, is that social protection can actually be a critical counter-cyclical buffer because it provides a means of stabilizing income and demand. Well, certainly I think like unemployment benefit, it's kind of evident that it's a counter-cyclical buffer. But NREGA, the demand for which very clearly rises when there is no other job available, is also important. And therefore it becomes a means of stabilizing or at least preventing a free fall of income and demand during shocks and downturns. And that's why we find that countries that have had large or reasonable protection systems in place have had less severe decline in economic activity, even in the current pandemic. There are two kinds of things that actually operate here. One is there's a basic level, if you like, of social protection that is provided. And then there are things that kick in or are more likely to be used when there is a shock or a downswing. That's the second type. And then the third is that the extent to which governments actually add on programs during a pandemic or during a remarkable and unbelievable shock like the one that is being experienced today. So there are three levels at which this social protection can operate in playing this counter-cyclical role. So now let's look at what actually happened in the pandemic. India, as we all know, had the most stringent and unprepared, unplanned, I would say even brutal lockdown in the world. The chart here is on the left is taken from the monthly economic report of the Indian government's Ministry of Finance. So they're proudly declaring that we had the most stringent lockdown in the world. Of course, this is a government response tracker that actually puts India at a slightly lower level. Number of other indexes that put India at 100. You could not have been worse than we were, more stringent, more extreme, more preventive of any activity than we were. But nevertheless, we're very much out there in terms of the most stringent lockdown. And the government has also clearly admitted that this is related to the extent of the GDP fall. Now, why do you have a lockdown? Obviously, to control the number of cases, right? That was the part we were unsuccessful, as is very evident from the right-hand side, which is taking the big three, as we are now unfortunately called, India, Brazil, and the US. India, until just a few days ago, was below the US and Brazil in terms of daily number of cases. We have now surpassed that. We have also surpassed Brazil in terms of the total number of cases. And we will soon surpass the United States in the total number of cases, simply because the United States number of cases has stabilized, whereas ours is still on an upward exponential trajectory. So clearly, we didn't really manage to control the disease through the lockdown. This is one of those things that requires a lot more discussion, because we are actually the worst performer, not just in the G20, but even in South Asia. Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh actually have a better COVID-19 performance than we do. And it's not because they're not counting cases. I mean, so we are not either, right? So let's not kid ourselves in terms of saying, well, they have. It's actually extraordinary to find that despite this very, very severe lockdown, in Pakistan they declared a lockdown, but it was really not implemented. Imran Khan was not in favor of it. It was effectively not enforced. So it was it was pretty much open. In Bangladesh, again, there was a lockdown, but it was much more partial, and people were given 7 days notice to prepare. In Sri Lanka, again, partial lockdown and 4 days notice. We are the only country in the world that imposed such a major draconian lockdown where everything was shut. All forms of transport, all forms of economic activity, any form of mobility, everything was shut like a military curfew with 4 hours notice, with no preparation, and without even the state governments being informed. This is actually unthinkable, but it's true that this is what happened. And as a result, I think all of you know what this meant. It meant that in a country with no social protection for most of the workers, they were thrown out of livelihood without notice. And you manage for a week, you manage for 2 weeks, you manage for 3 weeks. Remember, the original lockdown was 21 days. It was going to be 21 days as opposed to the 14-day Kurukshetra that we were going to beat the coronavirus. Then extended for another 2 weeks, then extended for another 2 weeks. So let's say 2 months of full lockdown, and then very, very gradual unlocking thereafter. Hesitant unlocking also. In some states, it also kept reversing because the cases would go up and then they would impose another lockdown and so on. But in this period, basically, you had employment and livelihood collapsing. And there was no compensation. Now, I think this is critical. In most of the developed countries, and even in developing countries like Brazil and Vietnam and so on, and certainly in China, those who were forced to give up incomes because of the lockdown were given income compensation. This did not happen in India, okay? And this is actually a very critical feature of the combined crises that we face today, the crisis in health and the crisis in the economy, is that not only did we not have an existing system of social protection because our workers are not formal, we don't have unemployment insurance, we don't even give them adequate health coverage and so on, we did not have a response in a downturn other than the MNREGA. So that was the only minor response that we had available in a downturn, the counter-cyclical response, and we didn't do anything additional as would be required. I think you all know the nature of the package, very, very little, but also the food, additional food security that was granted, 5 kilograms additional free per month for those who are registered under the NFSA, that is those who have the central government's ration cards, was very limited, exclusionary, and certainly inadequate. And the other kinds of payments that were given, 500 rupees to Jan Dhan accounts and so on, they were so small as to be laughable. The Jan Dhan accounts don't even account necessarily for the poorest of the poor. There's a lot of double counting. There are at least 21% what are called dead accounts that have never been operated since they were opened. And so there's a problem with providing such little dribbles of relief when your problem is so much larger. Okay, so then we have, of course, the recent data about the decline in GDP. And much has been made about how, it was a 24% decline, 23.9, but let's say 24, which made us the worst hit among G20 countries, again, the worst hit among South Asian countries, pretty much the worst hit among significant economies, okay? there was been, I don't know how many of you have been following the debate on other platforms, social media and so on, where the government spokesmen have argued that no, actually US declined by 24% and we only, or 25% and we only declined by 23% and so on. That's rubbish, okay? The right-hand side, which is the quarter-on-quarter decline, that is comparing April-June to January-March, and this is data from the IMF, that shows that India once again has the worst decline. So if you look at the way we look at it, which is the April to June quarter 2020 compared to the April-June quarter of 2019, then the decline is 24%. But since GDP grew, albeit very little, GDP didn't grow by very much last year, but it still grew over the quarter, right? So if you compare January-March to April to June, then you get even bigger decline, that is 26%. Again, much lower than all other countries. And you will find that a number of the countries on the left that have had relatively lower declines, well, China, of course, exceptional because China weathered the COVID experience in the first quarter of the year. China also did not have a national lockdown. It locked down only the state of Wuhan, and then for a brief period of about 12 days, the area around Beijing. And then wherever they had hotspots, they would do lockdowns, so what we call containment zones. But they never did a national lockdown. But all the other countries have more extensive systems of social protection or have put in place very, very large fiscal packages. Unlike India, whereas, you know, the fiscal package, depending on how you try and estimate it, has been, the announced fiscal package has been between 1.2 and 2% of GDP. The actual spending, as I'm going to show you, has been even less. So the bad news is that this 24% decline is actually not 24%, it's actually going to be much lower. It's a bigger decline, in other words. Why is that? Because the GDP estimate is usually based, especially the quick results are based on reports only from formal enterprises. And we haven't been told exactly how many, but we do know that a significantly lower number of formal enterprises actually responded during the pandemic. So already even the formal enterprise data is problematic, but unorganized informal enterprises are entirely excluded, okay? For that, you will actually need to have to do a survey. That's never done for this. The last survey was actually done in 2004-05. The CSO has not done a proper survey that would allow it to estimate the relationship between formal and informal. And so all our GDP data after that is actually suspect, I would argue. Certainly the new series suffers from that. It suffers from a number of other problems. But one of the very big problems is that it is supposing that the growth in the formal sector is mirrored in the informal sector. And we know that's not true. We know that demonetization disproportionately affected informal activities. We know that the GST also made informal enterprises, you know, significantly, it hit them harder. And this pandemic, it's very clear, also hit informal activities much, much worse. So when the final data emerge, because you see, these estimates get revised and revised, the final actual data for April, June 2020 is going to be known to us only, let's say, in 2025. Really, I mean, that's the way in which the GDP data get revised. But even that would have been an underestimate because we wouldn't have factored in the informal sector. That eventually seeps up, okay? The rot seeps up. That's what happened with demonetization, that you ignored that collapse. You therefore claimed that the year after demonetization, 2017-18, you had GDP growth of 8% because formal enterprises were doing very well and they were entering into the markets earlier serviced by micro and small enterprises. I wonder how am I doing on time? Okay, I should hurry up a bit. And it's only when that lack of demand, that collapse of demand in all the informal activities translated into lack of demand for formal enterprises that we started seeing the slowing down even there. And then by 2018, 2019, you had a progressive deceleration until you got to about 3.2% in the last quarter of 2019-20. But also, even these data tell us that the employment response is going to be much worse, because the most employment-intensive sectors are the worst affected. Construction down by, I think, more than 50%, retail trade down by 47%. There's an increase in agriculture because there was a good Rabi harvest and there was a very good monsoon, so there are a lot of sowing. But that increase in employment in agriculture is probably disguised unemployment. It's workers who can find nothing else to do, helping out on family farms or working for much, much lower wages in agriculture. Most estimates are telling us that nominal wages are falling. Women workers are very badly affected in both employment and wages. And of course, what does this mean? It means that this is a collapse in demand. Demand had already collapsed, right? Consumption had already been declining according to the suppressed National Sample Survey, Consumption Expenditure Survey. But we know that consumption has collapsed. We know that private investment has collapsed. So a V-shaped recovery is impossible unless you get a major change in government fiscal policy, because that's the only thing now, that's the only agent left to spend. And this is where social protection becomes very important. So let me just tell you that so far, if you look at the spending during the pandemic, these are numbers taken from the CGA, the Controller General of Accounts of the Government of India. And we have the data till July, so the first 4 months of this year, which are really the pandemic months, if you like. Of course, receipts collapsed compared to the previous year. These are all relative to the previous year. Yeah? Blue numbers are for 2019, red numbers are for 2020. And there's been a decline in the receipts as expected, but we would have required a doubling of expenditure in this period just to counter the collapse that you have in all the other sectors of the economy. If you have to just shore up, that is, if you have to prevent falling off a cliff, you have to create a little, some kind of something that will stop that free fall, then you need a dramatic increase in public spending. Did we get that? No. We got a very marginal increase, as you can see. And this is in nominal terms. So subtract 2% for GDP deflator, 2 to 3%. Yeah? Let's look at particular sectors which you would expect to increase. Agriculture, there's some increase, again, not very much. Food and public distribution, this is a shocker. It's come down, okay? Why has this come down? Because the government actually has delayed paying the Food Corporation of India, and it has cut down massively on the transfers it made to states for their own food subsidies. Many state governments have their own food subsidies, and it used to provide some backup for that. It's cut down on that, and it's not paying the Food Corporation of India. At the same time, it is holding more and more stocks. When the pandemic began, the government was holding 72 million tons of food grain, when the buffer stock requirement is 24. At the end of July, the government was holding 104 million tons of food grain, because it had collected during the Rabi harvest about 40 million tons, and it had only distributed relatively small amount. Instead of which, many people had argued, including me, but that you should have immediately distributed 10 kilograms per household free to anybody who wants it. Don't ask for the ration card. There are systems in place. Many state governments have shown systems in place where you could actually provide 10 kilograms free to anyone who needs it, with ways of ensuring that there's no double counting, no double provision. They didn't do that. They've actually spent less, and they're pushing the Food Corporation of India into further disaster. It's a separate issue we can come back to. Health and family welfare. Now, come on, pandemic, right? This is the one where it has to increase. It was a pathetic amount to begin with. Less than 0.2% of GDP was spent last year in this quarter, and it has increased by only 11% in nominal terms, which is nothing. Okay, rural development has increased. That is the NREGA. As I said, that's the lifeline, but I'll come to that in a minute. Transfers to states. Now remember, state governments are doing all the heavy lifting, and they're the ones, by the way, responsible for all the social protection, really, in terms of health, education, nutrition, everything. State governments are holding the baby, right? They're running all the programs. Even the central programs are run by state governments. The transfers to states went up, but again, relatively little. And this is almost entirely because they finally paid up in July. They paid up the GST compensation dues that were due for the previous financial year, not this year. This year, they have refused to pay. They're saying we won't pay. But they actually finally paid up the last year's dues, and that's why you get this increase. But it's really not enough, considering that the state governments are the ones that have been responsible for doing the dominant part of the work of the pandemic, dealing with the pandemic. So what happened to fiscal federalism? Basically, as I just mentioned to you, state governments are already responsible for what we call the social protection for, other than some central schemes. And a lot of those central schemes, in fact, the central government has cut down on, right? Like Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan and so on. The lockdown was centrally imposed under the National Disaster Management Act, which is very centralizing, and it was done without consulting the states. I'm sorry, let me just go back. Oh dear, what do we do? Yes, the lockdown was imposed by the central edict, but the state governments were then told, you handle it. You handle the health, you handle the economic fallout, you handle the social fallout, it's your problem. What did the state governments do? They just basically front-ended their annual expenditures. They borrowed, they did whatever they could, they spent as much as they could. And now some of them are already reaching the limits of their annual budgets. However, they've been denied adequate resources. Even as I mentioned, the GST compensation that is due for the last quarter. The central government has now turned around and said, we're not going to pay you, you can borrow. Here are two options for your borrowing at higher rates than the center. Instead of the center saying, I owe you money, I will borrow and pay it back to you. The center saying, I owe you money, you can go and borrow it. And remember, state governments have, through GST, have given up their revenue raising powers. So any repayment will require them to cut back future spending. So this is actually only in India, right? Okay, MNREGA, it's been a lifesaver. But again, most states are reaching the limits of the spending available, okay? This is actually already outdated. This is from the 3rd of August, a whole month ago. But already you can see that the status of funds availability was dire, okay? The funds left across the board for all the states was only 11% of the total allotted funds, okay? Which is nothing. And some states were already in deficit, like Odisha. Also, in every state, you had a very large number of households that had already reached their 100-day limit. Remember that it's 100 days per household, and you can have more than one adult working. And so obviously every adult was working because you needed desperately somehow to have the money. Remember, migrant workers were allowed to be working on those as well. So urgently now you have to double the number of days work to 200 and extend it to all adults, not just per household, but say any adult, 200 days work, I would argue. So what do we do? How do we deal with this? Basically, the way out of this pandemic and out of the economic crisis that we're in, I would argue, must necessarily have a much bigger role for social protection. And to begin with, you have to be fair with the state governments, right? You have to pay them their GST compensation dues, and I would argue, provide them additional resources to deal with the pandemic. Why? Because the central government can borrow from the central bank, okay? It can do monetized deficits. State governments cannot. State governments have a hard budget constraint. The central government does not. So it doesn't make sense to deprive the state governments of money, especially when you're leaving them to do all the work. Second, I would say we must universalize the PDS more than ever now. We have such widespread hunger. The data that finally will come out on the extent of undernutrition is going to horrify all of us. If you were surprised or dismayed by 24% GDP, wait till you see human development indicators in a few years. They will be appalling. So to prevent that, we have to universalize the PDS. I would say provide 10 kilograms per household per month for at least the next 6 months. And as I told you, we have more than enough grain for which, by the way, we are paying 5 rupees 60 paisa per kilogram just to store it. So we would actually save money if we distributed it. I would also argue that it is incumbent on a government that disallows people from earning their livelihood to compensate them. So I don't even see this as social protection. I don't see this as a welfare measure. I see this as a necessary compensation. The state denied people their right to work. The state therefore has to compensate, and I would say provide 7,000 per family for, let's say, even 80% of households, because they are the ones who were deprived of the livelihood for that period. I've already talked about doubling the days of employment. I would say it's now necessary to start an urban employment guarantee program. We have a debt moratorium, which has just been extended. But I would argue that a moratorium is not really a solution. It's kicking a can down the road and making that can bigger as it rolls. Because what's a moratorium? It says you don't have to pay this month. Fine, but the interest that you didn't pay is added to your principal for the next month. So I don't pay in May, but then that interest gets added to my dues in June. I don't pay in June, the interest gets added to the dues in July. I don't pay in July, interest gets charged on that total amount, which has been increasing all this time. By September, I have this very large debt, and I'm still not in a position to pay. So I would argue the moratorium should be converted into a standstill. The difference is that you actually suspend the interest payments for that period. And standstills have occurred through history, internationally, everywhere in terms of debt payments. So, it's not something to be horrified at. Surely, if everything else can be suspended, then even debt payments can be suspended for that period of 3 months. And also, the Atmanirbhar Bharat program announced all kinds of schemes for credit for MSMEs and farmers and so on. We find that most of it hasn't reached. We find that banks have been reluctant to go in for credit to farmers and MSMEs. And we find that it's really whatever little money has actually been given, which is a small fraction, I think 30% of the huge amounts that were declared. Most of it has gone to the larger of the medium-sized enterprises. And of course, obvious, right? No brainer, we have to spend more on health. Not just for the pandemic required spending, but I'm sure all of you have noticed that other health spending has gone for a toss. All other health services have gone for a toss. TB patients are being denied medicines. Women are not going and getting deliveries in institutional conditions. Cancer patients are not getting treated. People with urgent need for operations are not getting their operations, and so on. So, there's a whole lot of pending stuff. And there is this massively increased requirement for pandemic-related spending. The NCR region already, just with the spike that we've observed over the last 10 days, is already seeing once again a tightening of the hospital requirements, and already the private and other COVID-19 hospitals are overburdened. Already we're finding that we're short of resources. The usual question, where's the money? And of course, this is the inevitable response whenever you mention, oops, what did I just do? Whenever you mention that money needs to be spent on certain essential areas, people say, oh, where's the money? So immediately, the center has to borrow from the RBI, monetized deficit. Now, this is not some crazy thing. Everyone's doing it. The US is doing it, Britain is doing it, France is doing it, Germany is doing it, Japan is doing it, Spain is, you name it, okay? If you want to look at developing countries, everybody's doing it. Africa's doing, South Africa's doing it, Brazil is doing it, Argentina is doing it, Mexico is doing it, etc., 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 okay? It can be done. Now, the usual argument is that this will be inflationary. It will not be inflationary as long as essential supplies are maintained, because demand is low, demand is collapsing, demand is falling further. What you're trying to do is to protect demand, to make it recover and protect that, prevent that free fall. So it's not going to be, this is deficit financing right now is certainly not going to be inflationary. What about the balance of payments constraint? Well, currently our demand has fallen so much that we even have a current account surplus. So it's that bad, right? These are not constraints for us. Our external debt is very, very low in GDP. These are not constraints for us right now. The only constraint is in the minds of policymakers. But that doesn't mean that this is the way out indefinitely. Obviously, as the economy recovers, we have to think of new ways of raising public revenues. I would argue that wealth taxes and taxes on multinational corporations are the obvious low-hanging fruit that have to be picked up. There's an estimate by S. Subramanian that if you tax just the top 965 families, that's not a lot, right? That's not even 0.0001% of the population, just 965 families. Tax them 4% of their wealth, you get 1% of GDP. That would double your health spending of center and state governments together. You could double that, okay? Now, this estimate was made before the pandemic. Since then, actually, the wealth of the top 965 families has increased. Mr. Ambani's wealth has also gone up by some 40%, but pretty much all of them, the wealth has increased. The other low-hanging fruit is that of multinational corporations, especially the digital giants. They evade taxes through this system called base erosion and profit shifting. You shift all your profits effectively to low-tax jurisdictions like Ireland or the Cayman Islands or the island of Jersey or Guernsey in the UK or the state of Delaware in the US, and so on. How do you stop that? There is a proposal, unitary taxation of global profits. And this is a global proposal, but India could well do it too. What do? You say, well, listen, I know that Facebook globally makes the following profits. I know that India accounts for 12% of Facebook users. I am going to tax Facebook's global profits at a 25% rate based on my share of Facebook's users. So you take a formula, sales, users, employment, depending on what would be relevant for that corporation. And ideally, you would need a global base rate. We have suggested in ICRIT, a commission of which I'm a member, that you should use 25%, which happens to be also the Indian tax rate at the moment. But essentially, it doesn't even require everyone to do it. Will Facebook stop operating in India if you actually say, I'm going to tax you at this rate? It cannot, right? Will Google stop operating in India? Will Amazon stop operating in India? No. If enough large countries do it, then the incentives for base erosion and profit shifting go. However, the final point, the most important point, and I've gone on too long, so I will stop here, is that the macroeconomic point that people miss out is that if you don't spend now, you're actually going to push the economy in a deeper hole. Why? Because households are not spending, industrialists, capitalists, employers are not spending. The only agency that can actually spend is the government. The more you say, oh, no, I have less tax revenue, so I have to spend less, the more you also add to that problem. You push the economy into a deeper hole. If GDP contracts, what will contract? Tax revenues, right? No surprise there. And so even when you're trying to control spending, your tax revenues will fall so much that you will still end up with a big fiscal deficit. And in fact, in some scenarios, you will get a bigger fiscal deficit even with lower spending. So it's complete macroeconomic madness not to be spending at this point, but it's also an expression of the deep cynicism of the government that it can do so at a time when there is such a humanitarian catastrophe. All this time a lot of this time I have talked about social protection in terms of its economic fallout. But we have to remember that in a sense, social protection is also essential for minimum economic justice. And ultimately that's going to be essential if we want to maintain democracy in the country as well. Okay, let me stop here. I'm sorry I spoke for slightly longer than I intended, but that's it. And I'm happy to take questions. I see there are lots of them. Somebody is going to.
Hello, Professor.
Hi,
yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of questions, and I think your last slide sort of responded to a lot of them because a lot of them are about sort of expenditure. So I'll just, I mean, you touched upon it towards the end about the cynicism in the government, but I'll just club those together and ask, how do you then argue against this mindset which sort of puts a premium on, monetary policy, that, inflationary pressure. And these are some buzzwords that keep getting repeated whenever these crises happen. So at the level of policy, how do you argue against it?
There's so much. Okay, at the level of policy, I think I've already made the argument, right? I mean, certainly, inflationary conditions will depend on the degree to which there are supply constraints in the economy. So the focus of public spending has to combine dealing with supply constraints, let's say infrastructure constraints, wherever required and so on, and ensuring the demand. So, I mean, it's just a question of being realistic about it. It's not that public spending is always inflationary. It is inflationary in situations where there isn't a lot of underutilized capacity and unemployed people. Wherever there is something that is stopping the multiplier process from working, some kind of a supply constraint, you deal with that supply constraint. So your public spending must take account of that as well.
So there's one question. What is really pulling us back to implement universal basic income in India? What could be the factors that are leading to this?
Why? You mean, what's the political economy of it? Why don't we do it?
Yeah.
Oh, this is a very big question, and it's a tough question. I mean, one could argue that this government is not particularly interested because it's able to, fool the people in other ways, right? And so it can sort of, Riya Chakravartiize people's perceptions, or else then quickly announce that there's, somebody is threatening to assassinate the prime minister, or there's a threat from our neighbor Pakistan, not from China because we don't dare, but from Pakistan, and so on. So there is that, of course. But I would argue that it's a bigger problem because, let's face it, it is not only a problem of the last 6 years. We have been abysmal in providing social protection, and we've been abysmal in human development, right? We've been it's very shocking that if you leave out the per capita GDP part of the Human Development Index and you just take the other two, then our rank falls to near the bottom. We're not even 126 or whatever, then we fall to 178 or something. So why is that? What is it about the Indian political economy where we really don't spend on these things? And I hate to say it, but I would suspect that it is the very deep civilizational damage done by the caste system. The caste system, even whether you actually explicitly believe in it or go by it or not, it has inured us to inequality. It has created an acceptance of inequality, a social tolerance for it that is unmatched anywhere in the world, where we can actually see, homeless people, mothers giving birth on the road, etc., without too much bother because we've stopped thinking of them as people like us. And that's a very deep issue. I think caste has done a lot of damage to us, not just as a society, but in terms of our potential for economic development.
Again, sort of at a more logistical end, I think Muhammad Abdul Bari asks, how far is universal public distribution system realizable if the family is in some place and the head of the house is employed as a migrant laborer at some place far away from his family? And I think this touches into the government's plans to have a ration card that sort of cuts across states. So
well, there you go. The portability idea is not new. It is not an invention of the Modi regime. The portability idea has been in the works planning for the last 12 years, maybe 15 years. I remember being part of a planning commission in the days when it still existed, working group that was looking at the issues of portability. It's not really difficult. It just needs sufficient political will and coordination. It could have been done a very, very long time ago. It wasn't done. And a large part of the not being done is against stinginess. It does, let's face it, the less people you actually have to provide for, the less you spend. So I think somewhere this stinginess has actually played into the fact that we haven't, it's not rocket science to make portability something possible, And you don't even need an Aadhaar card. This whole notion that portability, I mean, there's Nandan Nilekani's great what's the word for a bad contribution, the opposite of a positive contribution, negative contribution to this debate is to keep pushing the point that for all of this you need an Aadhaar. You don't.
There's also quite a few questions on just I think so about will divestment in PSUs revive the economy and something related to that. So I think questions about just the fiscal policy that the government should be following, about the schemes that were implemented, like the Ujjwala Yojana and food security to a lot of people, Ayushman, which you also touched upon. So why is this not working, and just about that, and what could work amongst these?
So, so several questions here. Let's pick up divestment first. So look, I mean, there are areas where I believe it's important to have public sector involvement and engagement. Development banks, I felt, was a very important thing that was destroyed by when Mr. Manmohan Singh was finance minister, actually. And I now hear that the Modi government wants to bring back a development bank, which I think is a great idea. I mean, it's stupid to demolish those. There are public sector areas in strategic industries, let's say Hindustan Aeronautics, which was a very well-functioning thing until you destroyed it by not giving it any orders. And you decided instead to build Rafale jets with your crony. There are important public sector enterprises that deliver social goods, public goods that have positive externalities that the private sector will not deliver as required. You definitely need to keep those in public hands, and so on and so forth, okay? That doesn't mean that the government should be in everything, I agree. But divestment should be done on those lines, not because, oh, I need money, so let me sell the family silver. You don't say, right now I don't have cash, so I'm just going to sell, you know, all my Navratnas. Even when they're giving you dividends, even when they're actually bringing you net profits and giving you revenues every year, you're going to sell them right now at, let's face it, bargain basement prices. And you will lose direction over critical and strategic areas of the economy. And then 10 years down the line, you'll be crying and wanting to create another public sector thing. Let me give you one more just final example of this. We had a drug producing company, anyway, from IPC, whatever it is, it was a drug which produced bulk drugs. We killed it. And we first privatized it, or it died, I forget what we did to it, but we killed it. And then suddenly, and then for the last 10 years, a lot of us have been saying that we are excessively dependent on bulk drug import, especially from one country, China. 6 years ago, the government also realized it. They set up a committee. Okay, the committee said you should encourage domestic production. That was the year you killed off the domestic public sector provider of bulk drugs. The same year that this committee came out with this. Now the government is saying, everybody stop buying from China, okay? Which basically means 90% of our drugs will not be produced because 90% of them import active pharmaceutical ingredients from China, okay? When we had the capacity, you kill that capacity, and then you say, oh, now we have to build it again.
There's a question on inequality as well. How will the lack of governmental investment in affordable education and the gaps in access to technology have a ripple effect in terms of widening the inequality and inequity in society? What are the possible solutions to this?
You know, I think what's happening now in terms of this emphasis on online education will have a terrible effect in terms of expanding the digital divide. It's really quite shocking how quickly and smoothly the government and the UGC in higher education has moved to this. But a lot of schools are also now doing this online education. And it's so inequalizing. It is so unfair and unjust because we know that most of our population, I mean, let's just look at, smartphone penetration. It's still around 1/3 of the population. And even when it covers a household, it doesn't mean that every child has access to a smartphone. What happens when they have classes together? And so on and so forth. So it's so unequalizing. Something we were talking about earlier, data are expensive. Connectivity is terrible. I am sitting and talking to you in an office somewhere else because my own campus has such terrible connectivity. I couldn't have done this lecture today. I couldn't have actually got through to you. So, we have so many things to fix before we can quickly jump on and say, well, yes, now it's all online and we're digital and it's wonderful. There are issues of infrastructure, there are issues of access, there are issues of enabling inclusion by providing people who don't have either the physical thing or the access to data and so on and so forth. These require much more government attention than they have so far. I haven't even seen, let's say, a task force for inclusive online education, which you would have thought is the obvious thing to do when you know that there's this pandemic and it's going to stretch on. Surely by now they should have, created something that would examine all of these and say, this is how we're going to do it in a way that ensures access to everyone. Instead, everyone's just Atmanirbhar.
So there's a couple of questions on just calculation. So one is by Gaurav Manchanda. Is there any way that we could calculate the shock to the unorganized sector? And something related to that, I'm just clubbing it in, is that what is the best way to calculate the GDP given all the data constraints?
So, GDP, let's face it, GDP really sucks as an indicator, okay? And everyone says, oh, but it's all we have. And that's because they don't really know what goes into the calculations. And I promise you, I have tried to look a little bit. The more you realize how they calculate GDP, the less you have any respect for that number, okay, as an indicator of anything. And quite apart from the conceptual reasons, okay? I mean, there are huge conceptual flaws. We know that bad things generate more GDP, right? A polluting, congesting, terrible system of privatized transport generates more GDP than a clean, green public transport system. A completely privatized and obscenely unequal health service provision generates more GDP than a public, entirely free, and so on. Okay, so we know that GDP often measures the wrong things. We also know that GDP does not take into account a huge segment of the care economy, which without which societies would not exist. And therefore, it also undervalues work and the unpaid work of women in particular. Okay, so but these are all conceptual flaws. Now, let's consider just the pure calculation, especially in a country like India, which has so much informal activities. There is so much guesswork in this that it is amazing. Okay, so how do we do agriculture? You have some crop surveys, you have some surveys. Again, these are sometimes aerial, sometimes you get information from various agricultural research universities and stations, and you get some crop survey, this much sowing, this much cutting, and so on. And then you get estimates of prices. Now, if you have looked at all at mandi prices, you will know how varied they are. If you look at, I looked once at just 32 mandis and I was going mad because the variations were like, 5 times the lowest to the highest price on the same day of the same month. So depending on where you have picked your data points, you will get a particular value of the agricultural product for that. Okay. They don't always use the same data points. This is the other bad news I have to tell you, just for agriculture. Okay, so there's agriculture. What about industry? Well, we have organized manufacturing, that at least you have official data, except that they stopped using the index of industrial production. They moved instead to company reports. Now, you and I both know company reports are very flawed. They also include a whole range of other things. It's very hard to segregate the actual output from other stuff going on, and even to segregate into industry and services very clearly. But nonetheless, that's what they're doing. A whole bunch of other services, 95% of the people involved in services are informal. But there's a 5% in the formal services, telecom, or the stuff that you and I are doing, and all of that. How do you estimate the rest of it? You can't really estimate it, you have to guess. And so what is going on today, all the GDP numbers where we're sitting here and saying, oh, it's gone down, but it was 4.2, no, it's 4.3, 5.7, no, is it 23.9, no, it's 22.1. They're all meaningless. If you realize how it's been calculated, you would be so cynical. I mean, decimal point to bhul jao, it actually makes very little sense, even that number, because so much of it is guesstimate. Now, it's bad enough that it's guesstimate now, But the quick estimate, which is what we're looking at, right now, the quick estimate is 90% guesswork. And I've had this from people who are closely involved, people who are in the National Statistical Commission and so on, admit that the quick estimates are really not garbage exactly. They would never say that about their own estimates, but they are a lot of guesswork, guesstimates, and a lot of that is also politically influenced.
So we're slightly over time, but I think there are a couple of questions, so I'll just take those. And why has monetary policy proved rather ineffective in stimulating demand? I understand that monetary policy does not have the same effect as fiscal policy, but it still should have some. Should a more aggressive monetary policy be employed?
Monetary policy has many different aspects to it. The rate of interest is one of the weakest instruments, actually, in monetary policy. And I presume you've all read Keynes, or I don't know whether the world has changed so much that you guys don't know about the liquidity trap anymore. But you're living through a liquidity trap period, okay? You grew up in that. Ever since the global financial crisis, it's been broadly liquidity trap zone for the advanced economies, right? Japan's had it for nearly 3 decades now. Rate of interest is a blunt instrument. What did the other monetary policy consist of? It basically consisted of throwing liquidity out at the world, which was underwriting any kind of expenditure. Now, why doesn't that work? Because let's say the banks who get a lot of free money effectively, they will then choose either to fix their balance sheets and make themselves look good, and then to invest it wherever they think it's profitable, which turns out to be in speculative assets, again in finance. So a lot of that liquidity just built up another asset bubble or many other asset bubbles rather than generate new demand. Supposing you've done even the same monetary policy in a slightly different way. Instead of giving it to banks, supposing you basically told homeowners your mortgage is cancelled. It's the same thing, it's a monetary policy, right? But you didn't do that. There's a class element to that. But if you had done that, you would have immediately had a demand effect. You would have had homeowners then saying, okay, now I don't have to pay mortgage and I don't have to get out of my house. I can spend on other things. Yeah. Supposing you told students your debt is cancelled, they can then get out and spend on other things. Yeah. So there are many ways of doing monetary policy. We've developed a rather minor way of doing monetary policy. What's the point in a recession? The point is to increase demand. So that's why I've been putting a lot of emphasis on fiscal policy. But it's also true that in monetary policy, there are ways of doing things which are not the ways that have been usually presented.
Just last question.
Yeah.
So I'll just club two. How do you go upon doing an economic revival while also ensuring that the caseload does not go up? And secondly, given the disastrous economic situation, where would you recommend us as economics academia to channel most of our research efforts and activism into?
Oh, wow, two very big questions. How do you, well, listen, I mean, obviously, any new production will be costlier because you have to do physical distancing norms, you have to pay for people to come and go, transport is more complicated, etc. We have to recognize that it will be more expensive. And therefore, it will also be more muted. There's no doubt about that. So there's no point saying, oh, we're going back to double-digit growth and, whatever, 5 trillion GDP and all that nonsense. We have to recognize that these are things. We have to focus our attention of economic revival on the areas that need it most. So I would say particularly the bottom 50% of the population is where we should think of the kinds of ways of delivering economic activity that would be the most viable. And it's also been seen now, certainly a number of the countries that have been more successful in dealing with it, whether it is Thailand or Vietnam and so on, that you can manage all of this with maintaining certain basic norms. Basic cleanliness, which means you give everybody access to water. That's not easy in India. You give them access to soap and etc. You make everyone learn how to wear masks properly. That's a very big ask in India. Nobody knows how to wear a mask properly, certainly not our ministers in the cabinet. But you do a few of these basic things and you try and ensure physical distancing as much as possible. It's very clear we're going to have to live with this for a while. We have to get back to some semblance of normality, but it means ingraining certain norms and procedures and recognizing that these will be more expensive. You cannot do it on the cheap like we do everything else. What do you as young economists, what should you do? Well, you know, I think one is that it's very important not to get diverted by a lot of the crap. I'm using crap, it's not a correct term, and excuse me for being unparliamentarian about this, but you know, a lot of the economics profession does the much more technical, glossy equivalent of the Sushant Singh Rajput obsession. It distracts. It actually takes your attention away from the things that matter. And it gets you, entices you into, and there's a reason for this. And it's the same reason that the media is doing all of that. It's because there's a power thing involved. There's a power imbalance and a power equation. And those in power don't want you to focus on certain things. Unfortunately, the economics discipline has got a lot of that as well. And I don't want to do too much of this, but it's very clear that a focus on certain, I mean, it's not that I'm against maths, but it says that the minute you're focusing on a particular kind of very esoteric model that has very little relevance for anything that's going on in the economy or the world today, then you're taking some of the best minds away in another direction. Okay, there are other areas of development economics where I think this power imbalance is also true. I don't want to get into that, but I think it's important for young people to be aware of that. It's also difficult because those power imbalances mean also that jobs, scholarships, publications, a lot of that follow that route. Maybe slightly less so now, but to be relevant, you have to be able to cut through a lot of that crap, I think.
Thank you so much, Professor. That's all, but I think this was an excellent session. I think all of us would have enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.